Invest Africa, proudly brought to you by KPMG.
Hello and a warm welcome to this special edition of Invest Africa. I'm Natasha Jacobs. Thank you for joining me. Now, Africa is no longer the deep, dark continent of civil war and famine. As the global economy slows, the world's looking to growing markets like these with optimism. But how does Africa compare to other emerging markets? Considering that the continent is made up of 54 countries, each with their own political and economic landscape. Understanding how Africa works is not a simple exercise. So how can business navigate this complicated scenario? Joining me in studio to share their insights is Dr. Martyn Davies, CEO of Frontier Advisory, Mark Barnes, Global Head for Emerging Markets at KPMG, and Sisa Ntshona, President of the Enterprise Development Council of South Africa. Tonight we're also joined by a live studio audience. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Natasha.
Now, Martyn, I actually had you in this exact seat a year ago, and we spoke about the negative narrative around emerging markets. 12 months down the line, has anything changed?
Actually, I can't believe it's a year. I think, look, the world for emerging markets has changed dramatically in the last year and a half or so. Emerging markets have been squeezed by two very enabling growth forces. One has been QE out of the US, which came to an end in December 2014. And the second was the China-driven commodity supercycle, again pump-primed by Chinese capital of $600 billion. Now, clearly, QE is over. The Chinese commodity supercycle peaked sometime in late 2012. China's growth is on relative decline. So the new sort of thing to note going forward, I think, emerging markets now have to work for growth, whereas previously growth was artificially sort of enabled by both East being China and West being the United States predominantly. If we go back even before that to 2007, 2008, 114 emerging markets, 114 countries were growing at 5% or more. Growth was a rising tide lifted all boats. And I say again, nowadays, a global economy, countries have to work to grow. Some will figure it out, perhaps some won't.
So hard at work, Mark, but they are on the radar. And let's talk about last year, KPMG released its high growth market outlook. And you surveyed executives operating in these markets. How big on the agenda are high growth and emerging markets for corporates?
Well, I think, Natasha, certainly what we've seen is a real rise in interest in emerging markets. What's interesting, I find, is that you go back 3 or 4 years when we did the first survey, and it really was, I think, most CEOs would be impacted by the fact that we had a downturn in Europe, the US was coming out of recession, so on and so forth, and a little bit of nervousness of spending cash. Now you're seeing businesses that have a lot of cash, a lot of capital they want to invest in to grow. You think about the way a business is structured. Most of their revenues are from mature markets, and yet you've got a burgeoning opportunity in emerging markets, and we're seeing that in the survey results. So, for example, top of the agenda was 80% of CEOs are looking to invest overseas. The majority of that investment, 70+%, is going to be in emerging markets, but there are challenges.
Before we get to the challenges, let's talk about the opportunities, Sisa.
Sure.
Why have these markets become so attractive? Is it all about capturing that consumer market? I mean, in Africa alone, we're looking at 1 billion people, 2 billion by 2050.
Yeah, I think it's also primarily about what does all this growth mean, to Africans themselves. Because everyone's talking about this, about how well it's happening, but is it being felt on the ground? Is the average business person in Malawi, in Kenya, experiencing this uplift, right? And we always hear about this burgeoning middle class coming through. What does it mean, And the issue is about inclusive growth, because if growth happens, however, it's kind of not staggered right across the economy, you're going to have issues of inequality starting to creep in, and that's got its own problems further down the line. So it's a bit of a balance that we're trying to look at.
But Martyn, investors are literally spoiled for choice these days. We've got the BRICS countries, we've got the emergence of smaller markets like Indonesia, Turkey. How do you choose which destination to invest your bucks in? As Mark says, companies are sitting with capital to invest, but how do you know which market is suitable for that investment?
I think just picking up what Sisa said and what you said as well, Natasha, is Africa has roughly 1 billion odd people now. The most recent forecast, to update what you said, is by 2050, the United Nations projects 2.7 billion people.
That's scary.
Now, China currently, last census, is 1.34 billion. Current trend by 2050, which is just 35 years away, less than 2 generations, a generation 20 years. In 2 generations' time, there'll be 2 Africans for every 1 Chinese. Now, this is a staggering number. That sort of explosion in population has never happened in human evolution.
So does that make Africa a more attractive destination?
Arguably, yes, and I'll tell you why. And what you said now, Mark, just is that you've seen capital traditionally has been attracted to resources on our continent. The last decade or so, in line of Africa rising, capital has been attracted to demographics. Hence, Nigeria is very attractive and sexy to capital. Arguably, Ethiopia, Kenya, South Africa. But what about the small emerging markets in Africa? Over 35 African countries have a population of 12 million or less. So what about the future small countries? But what we'll see going forward, and this is what I'm hoping for our continent particularly, and you talk about inclusive growth, Sisa, is exactly this, is will capital start to move from resources to demographics, but ultimately capital must go to governance. And we'll start to see countries, coming to your point, countries that are rewarded for better governance, Asia style arguably, rather than just because we exist or we have good resources, natural resources, or we have a sizable population. Capital must reward governance. And I think ultimately those are going to be the success cases, no matter where they are, going forward.
So that's the future plans, but Mark, what are they looking for right now?
So I agree with Martyn's comment then. Certainly good governance is what's going to attract foreign investment. But just going back to your point as to what are CEOs looking for, what are businesses looking around for in terms of countries. If you step back, the BRICS were clearly on the tip of everybody's tongue, but it's much broader than that. What comes out in the survey now is that businesses are looking at Africa, they're looking at ASEAN, as ASEAN's growing, as governance getting stronger in around the 10 countries in ASEAN. China is still a big opportunity. It's obviously well organised. The messages from the government are going in the right direction in terms of corruption and piracy, of IP. If you look at India, for example, India put out a very business-friendly budget from the new Modi government. So there is an opportunity for renewed interest there, and we're seeing that. Certainly the conversations I've had over the last 3 months really geared towards India at the moment. But Africa remains of real interest, given the size and clearly the demographic growth is going to be very explosive over the next 5 to 10 years for entrance into the market.
Sisa, we've seen big nationals coming to Africa aggressively. But what about the smaller businesses and companies? Are we seeing a renewed interest from them as well?
Sure. I think that the mood is changing on the continent. Whilst previously you could literally parachute in as a multinational, extract all the minerals and kind of get them to port as quickly as possible, and that's that. The environment that we're in now is where it's a bit of a collaborative model. If you are going to operate in an economy, you've got to immerse yourself into that economy. You've got to interact with the businesses that are actually evolving within that space. We're starting to see now a nice collaborative effort between SMEs, emerging businesses, and these big multinationals who are coming in. And within that space now, you're starting to see the economy starting to, it can't be growth only happens if you're multinational coming in and there's oil extraction, whatever it is. It's got to be inclusive right across the board, right? So even, the corner cafe, as a result of a dam being built, gets uptick in terms of, the turnover, because of that ecosystem. That's what you're going to start to see a lot more than previously before. And I think the world is aware of that. Certainly when I hear a lot of CEOs speak nowadays, they talk about what can we do? How do we become part of the solutions? How do we help with improving governance if that's probably a shortfall? How do we help you with some of the examples or lessons that we've learned around the world in order to apply and really kind of fast track the pace of development in those countries?
Now in Africa there is space in some countries for those collaborative relationships with engaging with government, but other markets are much more closed. I mean, Ethiopia, for example. How do you advise your clients, Martyn, to navigate these territories? Because some governments want the money, but not very interested in negotiating around it.
I think, as Sisa mentioned, I think localization is there's a bit of a paradox here. is, of course, robust growth in Africa, relatively high yield for capital, international business will move in. But at the same time, there's a far greater perception now than there was a year ago during our last conversation around risk in Africa. So, real or otherwise, that will encourage the interest of companies to move in, of course, is there, but increasingly companies will have to, because of their perception of risk, will also seek to localize at a far more rapid rate. I think that's the first point that's important. I think secondly, on the inclusive nature, I see something across the continent which may be concerning, and I think this inclusive growth is a new phenomenon, this new phrase, and of course it's imperative to have embedded middle classes.
Well, we've heard it at every World Economic Forum for the last 3 years.
Yes, but let me be slightly contrarian and say inclusive growth should not be a synonym for interventionist state or socialist policies. And I think often it's misinterpreted. For me, ultimately, the countries, and you mentioned, Mark, the Modi pro-business budget put in place in India, we need to see countries like Brazil, Nigeria this week have their own Modi moment, i.e. a political shift enabling the economy being more pro-business. For governments to act in the name of inclusive growth in a more interventionist, anti-capitalist fashion, I'm afraid, will result in exactly the opposite to inclusive growth.
Sure. What's, is Africa is sometimes looked as if it's one big homogenous kind of big country.
Which is very frustrating with 54 very unique.
Absolutely, jurisdictions are very, very different. What is going to see, though, there is competition for this capital amongst the countries in Africa. So that South Africa realizes they didn't pull up their socks. Geez, there's Nigeria down the line, there's Kenya down the line.
When we look at the growth numbers, we know we're near the rest of the continent.
Absolutely. So we're competing with each other all the time, which is actually quite good, because now it kind of doesn't allow us to sit back and kind of say, well, capital's going to come anyway. It's about what do we need to do? How do you create that conducive environment that attracts capital and, more importantly, retains it basically for the growth of the country?
There's, again, exactly that. There's this tectonic shift, I would say, whereas previously African countries stereotypically would compete for aid, and aid always rewards the worst performers. It's a perverse reward system. Now we're seeing states having to compete for capital, private capital, and private capital always rewards the best performers. That's that shift I'm talking about.
Right.
Mark, who's getting it right? Who's winning that battle?
Well, I suppose if you compare and contrast, China and India, for example, okay, the way the governments are organised are slightly different, clearly, but China have done very well, and they've attracted a lot of foreign investment, notwithstanding the fact that we're seeing a slight downturn in the way the economy is growing, but you could argue that's also planned as well. And then you compare it with India, for example, which has struggled tremendously, and it'll be interesting to see whether the sort of business-friendly perspective of the Modi government will actually attract more investment. That will be interesting to see, and I think Africa can draw lessons from those two countries very clearly.
Are there some African countries, from your perspective in speaking to your clients and corporates, that are getting it right, bar South Africa?
Well, I think some of the larger multinationals, like and these are companies that have been in the region for many, many years, like the GEs, the Colgates of this world. But I think, you step back and looking into Africa from outside, it's a big unknown continent. There's a lot of global PR from Africa that's required really to attract good foreign investment in the right places that isn't in the Nigerias or the South Africas of the world.
Well, gentlemen, we've spoke about the potential. Now let's get into the barriers right after this break. It's time for a quick break, but when we come back, we'll continue with our discussion on emerging markets and Africa's role in it. Welcome back to Invest Africa. Tonight we're bringing you a special broadcast together with a live studio audience and a panel of experts who are looking at how Africa compares to other emerging markets, the opportunities and challenges. Remember, you can tweet us on @CNBC Africa using the hashtag InvestAfrica. Still with me in studio, Dr. Martyn Davies, CEO, Frontier Advisory, Mark Barnes, Global Head, Emerging Markets for KPMG, and Sisa Ntshona, President of the Enterprise Development Council of South Africa. Gentlemen, thanks for staying with us. We've spoken about the opportunities. There's definite investment. Sentiments changed, as Martyn has said. But Mark, what about the barriers? And this is something you extensively touched on in your high outlook survey.
Yes, I mean, when we talk to our clients and CEOs around the world, it's very clear that there are some common themes when it comes to entering these markets, and they're probably, they're the usual suspects. First of all, strong infrastructure, strong governance around anti-corruption, access to talent. One of the things that moved to the top of the agenda, which I think is very pertinent for Africa and the 54 different countries, is culture. And culture is a big issue when going into these markets, particularly as you structure the workforce and the management to actually run the business.
Localization, Martyn?
Undoubtedly. I think it's picking up what Mark said about culture. It's about a culture of the comparative advantage increasing of states will be the ability to get things done, quite simply. And I think increasingly in our continent, you're seeing that. You're seeing the countries that can get things done. It's not about political models, it's about state effectiveness. We would call it in South Africa a developmental state. I think maybe others could start to talk about more performance-driven states, and that speaks to the culture. So I think increasingly this needs to be recognized by capital, by companies, needs to be rewarded, but ultimately it's something which is very hard to measure. I mean, what makes, it's very relevant this week in the news, what makes Singapore such an effective performance-driven state? It's a culture that's driven from the top leadership in that country. And increasingly countries need to act more as organizations, as performance-driven organizations. Yeah. And I think that's something in key countries in our continent. Think Rwanda, think Ethiopia, obviously think Mauritius, where you start to see this emerge very rapidly.
They also mentioned infrastructure, and this word makes me shudder from a South African context. Sisa, how do we get that right? Because, I mean, we talk about this week in and week out.
Just touch on the culture part a little bit. You know, culture is such a difficult thing because you can't touch it. Right. Right?
And it's unique to each country.
Absolutely. Well, you've got 54 different cultures. In fact, within each country, you've got subcultures in there as well. Try to maneuver your way around there is going to be quite an art, basically. Infrastructure. Well, infrastructure is very much a big barrier, actually, to doing business in Africa. In fact, if I can take one step back, just look at intra-Africa business, right? When you understand that it's cheaper to move products via Europe to a country next door than directly, then there's a problem within that, right? Now, for every problem, it poses also an opportunity. Right, so I always say anything in Africa that goes into the ground has got to be good, right? When you start understanding that, you know, our joint power situation as a continent, we probably have the same power generation capacity as Spain, basically.
I had a scary conversation just a little bit earlier that Africa's electricity consumption, with South Africa included, is likened to consumption in the state of New York.
Absolutely. Well, absolutely.
Right.
So therefore, again, look at that backlog. Right? So for the next couple of decades, that's going to be the space to play. So you're talking infrastructure on dams, roads, power, rail, how to move goods across, basically. You know, and I think therein lies some of the problem. We've really got to increase the level of intra-Africa business happening. You are more likely to pick up Kenyan products in London than in South Africa, yet we're a 3-hour flight away. And I think therein lies some of the issues over there as well. And also as well, I mean, if you're in an economy like South Africa, bumbling along at about 1.5, 2%, right? 45 minutes flight, you're in Mozambique, right? They're doing some decent percentages over there. So how do you start getting access to that market? Again, there's certain barriers around culture,
language,
infrastructure, language, basically, and those type of things. So these are just some, I suppose, the smart business people who have to maneuver and find their way around that in order to be able to access those markets.
Martyn, there's another one. Governance, corruption. How do we deal with that?
Look, this is almost a baked-in trait of a large number of frontier emerging market economies.
It's not unique to Africa.
No, of course. I'm looking globally here. So doing business in Brazil, doing business in Argentina, doing business in India, you have this common denominator of corruption to varying degrees. And again, you have a state that is not so much enabling as it is predatory. The Asian examples of success, think Singapore again, think Hong Kong, think Taiwan, think Korea post-97, it's a non-negotiable. Corrupt states ultimately become failed states. The wealthiest, most successful countries in the world, measured by Human Development Index, wealth of population, embedded middle class, are those that have fought the scourge of corruption. So for me, the sort of anecdotal, and again, unfortunately, a lot of the figures, the high, robust growth figures, as Sisa started out by saying, become almost meaningless if it's not true trickle-down economics and growth, and the majority of the people in that society are benefiting. If they're not benefiting, it's because of corruption. And that's not sustainable. It should not be from any perspective. It's politically unacceptable, it's economically unacceptable, most importantly, it's morally unacceptable. So I think for me, the indicator looking at emerging markets through a lens that's more sort of, more stricter lens perhaps, is which countries are taking most active steps to root out corruption at the highest levels. Those are the countries, for me, that have the true long-term sustainable growth trajectory. And there's a couple of those. You look at the Transparency International sort of rankings, give a pretty good measure, and you can just stack those up against economic wealth and success and Human Development Index, and they're almost a perfect correlation.
Mark, but it takes two to tango. Governments and corruption would not happen if businesses also took a hard line and saying, we're not going to pay your bribes, we're not going to buy that car to meet that minister. Surely it needs to start there as well.
Absolutely, and we see that with, if you look at the US, the FCPA, Federal Corrupt Practices Act is clearly instrumental in driving transparency across the business. So any business going into these markets has to abide by that. And I think that's what's really going to help, clearly, is making certain that any business, whether it's coming from an emerging market to an emerging market, is transparent, not just the US businesses coming into the emerging markets or the European businesses. It has to happen at home as well. I think also the promotion by the different governments that they are trying to do the right thing. Now that takes a while to trickle down into local government. We all know that. I was listening to the Modi speech, and I think one of the big responses from the audience when we were presenting a couple of weeks ago was, that's great, but what will happen on the ground? I think that's true to say in Africa as well. As these things change, how will they impact on the ground and really make a difference?
Sisa, I see you nodding.
Yeah, I mean, just the whole corruption issue has a couple of things. I think one is it takes two to tango, right? So there's a corruptor and a corruptee. You can't corrupt yourself. So it's...
And who's which is which sometimes?
Well, maybe you can.
Maybe you can, exactly. But all I'm just trying to say is that, in the whole conversation around culture, and it may be difficult at times to draw those lines. I earlier in my career I used to work for an American company, very prescriptive around what you can do, what you can't do. And their rules supersede the country's norms and cultures that you're in, right? So therefore, whilst it may be okay for me to buy Martyn lunch, right, I can't do it. And he may take offense that I'm not taking him out to lunch, but hey, I've got this other, do you get what I'm saying? So and that's what globalization does. It's the ability to be able to maneuver yourself whilst keeping all the integrity that you have, and being able to do business. It's about being able to go to Saudi Arabia and not taking you along on the trip because you can't be on the negotiation table. And you can talk all you want about human rights, blah, 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 basically. Their culture doesn't allow it. So what do? Which one kind of trumps the other one, if I put it that way? And I think therein lies in the space. I think that kind of leaves it a bit grey at times.
Ladies and gentlemen, of course, we have our audience today, and we want to give you the opportunity to engage with our panel as well. Sir?
Thank you. And thanks for a great discussion. Imad Bibai, I'm a partner in New York, responsible for the US-Africa corridor. And I think this was all great content. But when you look at Africa, what can the private sector do to create the ecosystem that makes markets successful, whether it's education, whether it's a talent pipeline, whether it's infrastructure? There is a role that the private sector can and should play to create that environment and get over some of the barriers, especially in areas that were typically state-run. So how can the private sector do that better?
What's the gentleman?
Well, just a couple of thoughts, and I'll let my colleagues answer on the panel. But you think about, you go back to the comment I made earlier about China and India, and I think China have been very successful because from the start they've really pushed industrialization and manufacturing. I think here in Africa we need to be in the same position where large private businesses are co-investing in producing infrastructure and platforms for industrialization which will drive jobs, and we're seeing that in a number of countries across the continent.
Martyn.
A different take slightly is the continent is a frontier emerging market. We're not developed, largely because of arguably dysfunctional states to varying degrees. The state-citizen contract is that the state needs to provide three very basic things. And I'll link this to inclusive growth. Private security, personal security, basic healthcare, accessible healthcare, and relatively good education. Those are the three, that's the contract. The citizen pays taxes to get those three basic services. In the majority of cases, these services are not rendered by the state. So as to your point, private sector, this is not just a moral imperative that the private sector must step in and provide these services. It's also the greatest business opportunity on this continent. You have relatively rising middle class. And those three basic necessities of life are a priority spend of anybody in any family. Right. So companies can do the right thing by contributing and shaping these sectors, and at the same time, very much so, make profit, and that's a great thing, whilst pursuing, inclusive growth strategies.
Sisa, so it's more than just CSI.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the world is changing. Triple bottom line reporting is something that is just not unique to emerging economies right across the board. I mean, I always say that it doesn't matter how much profits you're making, but if you're using child labor to make the products, hey, you're out the game. And essentially, it's kind of having that. So to corporates and multinationals out there, I always say is that stop admiring the problem, become part of the solution. However, you've got to embed this within your business model. So it can't be an afterthought that, listen, we've made some nice profits, so let's write a check and kind of walk away. But if you understand that by improving the plight of the people around me, I actually have a bigger market to sell to over time, right? And you've got to look beyond your term in office as a CEO, which is typically, 3 to 5 years nowadays, look at 10, 15, 20 years' time. So therefore, if I always say is that if the country that you're operating in fails, your business fails, irrespective of how great you operate. So therefore, it's in your interest to make sure that you're part of the challenges, you're part of addressing some of the solutions there.
Thank you for your question. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, gentlemen. Thank you. I think we highlight a few important parts today, and obviously it's not government, it's just business can play a big part in shaping the destiny of the continent. And emerging markets, better than 12 months ago. So some positivity there.
We're hopeful. We'll see certain countries will succeed and perhaps others still have some work to do.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, that's all the time we have for tonight. Thank you to my guests, Dr. Martyn Davies, CEO, Frontier Advisory, Mark Barnes, Global Head for Emerging Markets at KPMG, and Sisa Ntshona, President of the Enterprise Development Council of South Africa. A big thank you to our audience as well. Please remember to send us your comments. The details are on your screens right now. From myself and the Invest Africa team, it's goodbye and good night.